The key was in my hand, but the lock didn't recognize it anymore. I stood on the front porch of the house I had lived in for 31 years, the house where my wife Margaret and I had raised our son, where I had built a workshop in the garage, where I had planted a maple tree in the backyard the year my grandson was born. And I turned the key again, slowly, the way you do when you think maybe you just did it wrong the first time. The deadbolt didn't move. The handle wouldn't turn. I stepped back and looked up at the house the way a stranger would look at it, taking in the new welcome mat, the freshly painted shutters in a color I had never chosen, and a small camera mounted above the door frame that I had never installed. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I already knew who it was. I let it ring. My name is Gordon Whitfield. I am 67 years old. I spent 38 years working as a senior auditor for a mid-sized manufacturing firm outside of London, Ontario, and then another 4 years as a private financial consultant after I retired from that. I understand numbers. I understand documentation. I understand how people hide things in plain sight. And I understand how paper trails work, because I have spent the better part of my adult life following them. My son Trevor is 39. He is charming the way a salesman is charming, not because he genuinely likes people, but because he has learned that warmth is a useful tool. He sells commercial real estate. He is good at it. He has my father's blue eyes and his mother's easy smile. And for a long time I believed that meant he had inherited the best of both of them. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things when it came to Trevor, and the process of being corrected was one of the more painful experiences of my life. But I am getting ahead of myself. Margaret died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, which is the kind that doesn't give you much time to prepare. We had 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end, and in those 8 weeks I watched the woman I had been married to for 40 years become someone I barely recognized. And then she was gone, and the house became very quiet. I am not going to spend too long on that part because it still costs me something to describe it, and this story is not really about grief. It is about what grief can do to a person's judgment, and what other people sometimes choose to do when they see that your judgment has been softened. Trevor was attentive after Margaret died. I want to be fair about that. He called every few days. He came for dinner on Sundays. He helped me sort through her things when I was ready to do that. His wife Diane was kind. Their son, my grandson Owen, who was 6 at the time, kept me from disappearing entirely into the quiet. For about a year, I thought we were doing well. I thought we were one of those families that actually pulls together instead of pulling apart. Then Trevor started asking questions about the house. Not directly, at first. The way Trevor does things, he rarely comes at a subject directly. He circles it. He brings it up sideways, drops it into conversation between other things, lets it sit there while you talk about something else, and then returns to it a little closer than before. I had watched him do this with clients at dinner parties and always found it impressive. I found it considerably less impressive when I realized he was doing it to me. It started with concern. That is always how it starts. "Dad, this place is a lot to maintain on your own, don't you think?" I told him I managed fine. "The yard alone, I mean. You're not getting any younger. And those stairs, Dad, what happens if you fall?" I told him that if I fell, I would call 911, like any other person. "I just worry," he said. "Diane worries too. We were talking, and we thought maybe it makes sense to start thinking about your options. There are some really lovely retirement communities around here. You could be somewhere with people your own age, activities, support if you need it." I told him I was 63 years old, and I didn't need support. He smiled. "Of course not. I just want to make sure you're planning ahead." I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't the end of it. Over the following months, the conversation came back in different forms. Sometimes it was wrapped in practicality, the cost of upkeep, the property taxes, the fact that the house had appreciated significantly, and I was sitting on an asset that wasn't working for me. Sometimes it was wrapped in health, a mention that his friend's father had slipped on ice and spent 3 months in rehabilitation, a forwarded article about aging in place versus community living. Once, after I had a routine procedure done on my knee, he arrived at the hospital with Diane and Owen, and sat across from me in the recovery room with an expression I can only describe as calculated sympathy, and told me that moments like this were a reminder that we all needed to think about the future. I remember looking at my grandson playing with a toy truck on the floor beside the chair, and thinking that I was very tired of thinking about the future in the way Trevor wanted me to think about it. The house, by that point, was worth somewhere around $1.5 million. London real estate had done well over the 31 years since we bought it, and the neighborhood had become desirable in a way it wasn't when we were young. I knew this because I still paid attention to numbers. I knew what I had, and I knew what it was worth, and I knew that I had no intention of selling it. What I didn't fully appreciate yet was how far Trevor had already moved past asking. I found out in March, about 18 months after Margaret died. I was going through some paperwork, nothing unusual, just updating my files when I noticed that a document I had signed the previous autumn looked different from what I remembered signing. It was a financial management authorization, something Trevor had brought over one evening, describing it as routine paperwork his accountant recommended for estate planning purposes. He'd walked me through it quickly at the kitchen table, answered a couple of questions, and I'd signed it. I trusted him. He was my son, but looking at it again, carefully, the way I look at documents professionally, rather than the way I had looked at it that evening, I realized the scope of what I had signed was considerably broader than what he'd described. It wasn't quite a full power of attorney, not yet, but it was a step in that direction. And certain clauses, buried in language I hadn't examined carefully enough, gave him authority over decisions I had not intended to give him authority over. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that. I want to describe what that feels like, the moment you realize that someone you love has been methodically working around you. It isn't anger, not right away. It is something quieter and colder than anger. It is the recalibration of every conversation you've had for the past year, every gesture of concern, every Sunday dinner, every phone call, running them all back through a new filter and watching them come out different on the other side. It is the loneliness of understanding that the relationship you thought you had was not entirely the relationship that was actually there. I did not call Trevor. Instead, I called my lawyer. Patricia Okafor has handled my legal affairs for 22 years. She is methodical, unsentimental, and thorough, three qualities I value enormously. I drove to her office the next morning with the document and everything else I could find that seemed relevant, spread it across her desk, and told her what I suspected. She read everything carefully, asked me several questions, and then leaned back in her chair and looked at me the way she looks at things when she is organizing her thinking. "Gordon," she said, "I want you to understand something before we proceed. What you have here is concerning, but it isn't yet conclusive. If you confront him now, he knows you're watching. Documents disappear. Stories change. You won't be able to prove what you believe happened." I asked her what she recommended. "I recommend we proceed as though you don't know anything," she said. "And I recommend we spend the next several months making sure that when you do act, there is nothing left to argue about." That is the kind of lawyer Patricia is. Over the next 4 months, we documented everything. Patricia helped me quietly revoke the authorization I had signed, replacing it with a properly structured document that gave Trevor nothing beyond what any adult child might legitimately assist with. We did this carefully, without announcing it, without changing anything that would signal to Trevor that the situation had shifted. I also installed a proper security system in the house, cameras at every entrance, a professional system that stored footage off-site, and I told Trevor, when he noticed, that I had done it because of a break-in 2 streets over. He nodded and said that was smart. It was smart, but not for the reason I gave him. Meanwhile, I paid attention. Trevor continued his visits, his phone calls, his careful circling. He mentioned once, seemingly in passing, that he had a colleague who specialized in private real estate transactions, discrete arrangements, he called them, for families managing complex situations. I filed that away. He asked me once whether I had updated my will since Margaret died, and I told him I was working on it with Patricia, which was true, and which seemed to satisfy him temporarily. What I didn't know, what I was in the process of discovering, was that Trevor had already moved considerably further than I understood. Patricia called me one Tuesday morning in June. She had been making some quiet inquiries through channels she preferred not to describe in detail, and she had found something. Trevor had met with a real estate lawyer, not his usual commercial contacts, but a residential specialist. There was paperwork in motion, not yet filed, not yet complete, but in motion that appeared to involve the transfer of my property. The authorization I had signed the previous autumn, the one with the broader than described scope, had been used to initiate something. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the grocery store, where I had just bought milk and eggs, and I looked at the green of the trees along the street, and I breathed carefully in and out for a while. Then I called Patricia back and I said, "How long do we have?" "Weeks," she said. "Maybe a few months if we're fortunate. Then let's finish setting the trap." Here is what Trevor did not know. He did not know that the authorization had been revoked and replaced with a document that looked almost identical, but contained none of the authority he believed he had. He did not know that Patricia had been coordinating with a fraud specialist she trusted. He did not know that I had quietly transferred the property into a trust structure, something Patricia and I had completed 3 weeks earlier, which meant that the title he believed he was working with was no longer the actual title. And he did not know that the security cameras recording every entry and exit from my home were connected to a cloud storage system that kept 60 days of footage at all times. He thought I was a 66-year-old widower who missed his wife and trusted his son. He was half right. The trip to Halifax was Patricia's idea. She thought it would help if Trevor believed I was at a distance and distracted a long flight, an old friend, a week away from the house. My friend Douglas Carmichael, who taught with Margaret at Western for many years and who knew the full situation, agreed to have me visit. I flew to Halifax on a Sunday. I told Trevor I was going, mentioned it casually over the phone, and told him I had left a spare key with the neighbor in case of anything. I had not left a spare key with the neighbor, but Trevor didn't know that either. On Wednesday, Patricia called me at Douglas's kitchen table. "They moved today," she said. I had known it was coming. I had prepared for it. But knowing something is coming and hearing that it has arrived are two different experiences, and I sat very still for a moment before I answered. Trevor and a man Patricia identified as his associate, someone from the brokerage he had mentioned, had attended the house. A locksmith had been called. The locks had been changed. My locks on my house. They had also, according to what Patricia was able to learn through the title office, attempted to file a transfer document. The document had been rejected because the title they were working from was no longer valid. The trust transfer had been completed and registered, a fact they had not discovered. Their paperwork referenced a property that, legally, no longer existed in the form they believed it did. They had changed my locks on a house they did not own and could not transfer. I finished my coffee. I thanked Douglas. I called a car to take me to the airport. I flew home Thursday morning. I want to describe standing on that porch, because it is the moment I keep returning to. The new welcome mat, the painted shutters in the wrong color, the camera they'd installed above my door, my key not turning in a lock that had been mine for 31 years. The phone buzzing in my pocket, Trevor, calling to tell me some version of a story he had been preparing. I let it ring. I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to, just to feel the full weight of what had happened and what was about to happen. 31 years of a house. 40 years of a marriage, 39 years of a son, all of it condensed into a front porch on a Thursday morning in late June, with a key that didn't fit and a phone that kept buzzing. Then I pulled out my phone and sent Patricia a text. 3 words, "File everything now." She had been waiting for exactly that message. I walked around the side of the house to the back door, which Trevor had not thought to change the lock on, entered my home, put the kettle on, and called my daughter-in-law. Diane answered on the second ring. She sounded surprised to hear from me, and then very quickly she sounded afraid. I told her I was home. I told her I was sitting in my kitchen. I told her the kettle was on and I was going to have a cup of tea. And then I told her, very calmly, that Patricia had filed everything that morning and that Trevor should probably contact a criminal lawyer before the end of the business day. There was a long silence. "Gordon," she said finally, and her voice had changed completely. "I want you to know that I didn't. I told him not to." "I know," I said. "I know you did. That's going to matter." I drank my tea. I waited. Trevor arrived 40 minutes later. He came in through the front door. He had a key to the new lock, of course, and found me at the kitchen table with my hands around my mug and a folder of documents on the table in front of me. He stopped when he saw me. He looked at the folder. He looked at my face. Whatever he had prepared to say, he didn't say it. I told him to sit down. He sat. I told him what I knew. Not everything Patricia had advised me on exactly what to disclose and what to keep back for proceedings, but enough. I told him about the authorization, about what it had been used for, about the title that had been transferred into trust, about the filing that had been rejected, about the footage from the cameras that now lived in a server somewhere in Toronto. Trevor is his mother's son in some ways. When he is cornered, he goes quiet. He doesn't bluster. He sat across from me and he was very quiet, and I watched something move across his face that I hadn't seen there in a long time. Something that might have been shame or might just have been the recognition that he had miscalculated badly. "Dad," he said. "Don't," I said. He closed his mouth. "I don't know," I said slowly, "what you needed the money for, badly enough to do this. I don't know if it was the business debt, or something else, or whether you just looked at this house and decided it should be yours before it was yours. I'm going to let the lawyers in the court figure that part out. That's not my job." He started to say something else, and I held up my hand. "My job," I said, "was to protect what your mother and I built. That's what I did. The legal process took 14 months. I will not walk through all of it, because some of it is still difficult, and some of it is frankly tedious, and the outcome is what matters." The fraudulent use of the financial authorization resulted in charges. Trevor's associate, who had processed the locksmith call and filed the transfer documents, cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced charges and provided a detailed account of what had been planned. Trevor pleaded guilty to 2 counts of fraud and received a conditional sentence with significant fines, community service, and a period of probation. He did not go to prison. I want to be clear about that because I think people sometimes assume that a story like this is supposed to end with prison, and I am not sure that was what I wanted. What I wanted was accountability. What I wanted was for it to be on the record, permanent and documented, that this had happened, that the attempt had been made and had failed and had consequences. Diane filed for divorce 8 months after the charges were laid. She got primary custody of Owen. I see my grandson every second weekend and on holidays, and those are among the best days I have now. Trevor and I have spoken twice since the guilty plea. Both conversations were brief. I do not know what our relationship will look like going forward, or whether we will have one. That is a question I have learned to sit with rather than answer. The house is still mine. The maple tree in the backyard is taller than ever. I had the locks, changed back my locks. My key and the locksmith who did it was a young man from Kitchener who made a comment about the quality of the original hardware and seemed genuinely pleased to be restoring something rather than replacing it. I gave him a good tip. I have had time since then to think about what I would tell someone who found themselves in a situation like mine, someone who suspects that a person they love is working around them rather than with them, someone who is trying to decide whether to trust what they see or trust what they feel. Trust what you see. Document everything. Act slowly and carefully rather than quickly and emotionally, because speed favors the person who is already in motion, and patience favors the person who is paying attention. Do not let grief make you careless with what you have built. This is harder than it sounds. When you have lost the person who built it with you, the things you built together can start to feel less like assets and more like wait the yard, the stairs, the rooms that are too quiet now. People who want something from you will use that heaviness. They will frame your home as a burden and themselves as relief. They will call it concern. Some of them will even believe it, at least partly. But a home is not just a financial asset. It is continuity. It is the physical record of a life. The maple tree I planted when my grandson was born has his height marked on the garage wall at 1, 2, and 3 years old, in Margaret's handwriting. That is worth more than any offer on the table. Do not assume that age makes you a target. It does. Sometimes there are people who look at someone in their 60s or 70s and see someone whose edges have softened, someone who can be managed. Those people are usually wrong, and when they find out how wrong they are, it tends to be expensive for them. Get a good lawyer. Not because you expect to need one, but because having one means that when something unexpected happens, and something unexpected always eventually happens, you are already in relationship with someone who knows your situation and can move quickly. Patricia knew my files. She knew my intentions. That meant that when the moment came, we didn't lose weeks getting her up to speed. We moved the same day. And finally, it is possible to love someone and still hold them accountable. These are not contradictory things. I loved my son. I still do, in the complicated way that you love someone who has shown you something about themselves you cannot unsee. Loving him did not mean allowing what he tried to do to stand unchallenged. It meant telling the truth about what happened, clearly and completely, and letting the consequences follow. That is not cruelty. That is respect for him, for myself, and for everything his mother and I spent our lives building. The maple tree is going to be beautiful this autumn. I already know it.